Today I was really a little torn about the format, what format we should follow. And one idea I had is that I give the class my paper, which is really a book chapter 4 of a joint book we just submitted to Oxford University Press, and then you guys can start a discussion. So I will actually violate what I said last time, is that I'm not going to be giving a discussion, but with a short presentation by me. There is also a longer part of this presentation which focuses on Mexico. I'm not particularly hung up about Mexico, though I like the country very much. I've been there many times. But the reason why Mexico is being featured is because in my other class, the undergraduate class, I'm doing the Mexican Revolution. And the more I've done, the more I notice the relevance of Mexico to exactly our problem now. Is there such thing as populist constitutionalism? Because there's surely Mexican constitutionalism. It's a very strange version of constitutionalism, but it exists. Mexico has not had constitutionally unlimited government in the how they work is a very specific Mexican problem. So I may get to Mexico today, depending on how long I take on the first 4 parts of my presentation. Okay, so still we are with the question: is there such a thing as populist constitutionalism? And last time, by focusing on logic, I tended to side with those who said it was an oxymoron or a contradiction in terms. My friend Gábor Halmai, Hungarian jurist who teaches in Florence, Jan Werner Müller, who wrote books on populism, is their view. And lots of other people also think it, but there are lots of people who think otherwise. And I myself am ambivalent, primarily because empirically speaking, populisms have shown an interest in constitutional politics, maybe not as much as in Mexico, which is the most dramatic and interesting case, but they show some interest in constitutional politics, whether in replacement of existing constitution or the radical amendments of existing constitution, or court packing and thereby trying to influence the interpretation of constitution, or even passing unconstitutional statutes pushed through either through packed or weak courts. We see this everywhere. And so this tremendous interest, which certainly you would not show for fascism, with teaching a course on sociology of fascism in the fall, fascism surely has not shown a great interest in constitutional politics. And state socialism hasn't either, in spite of the fact that in the Soviet Union, in the early phase, there was a constituent assembly dissolved, and a Soviet constitution, which was then replaced in the 30s, again replaced in the 1970s. In spite of all that, leaving aside the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, state socialism or communism has not shown a genuine interest. Its opponents in the 1980s did by suggesting that these constitutions should be lived up to, and they used the Constitution as a tool in criticizing the regime's arbitrary and autocratic nature. Populism is not like this. It's not only the opposition who raise the question, although they do sometimes. The populists themselves don't. So how to explain this? Aside from all the empirical cases which you can read about in my paper and of course read elsewhere, which each had their own explanation, why Viktor Orban does it in Hungary, for example, Barbara will tell you this. It's because the 1989 constitution was supposed to be provisional. And it was supposed to be replaced. The in 94 to 9 fails. And Viktor Orban had historical reasons for raising this question again, aside from the fact that he wanted to have his own constitution and his own preamble and all the rest. But still, there is some kind of Hungarian issue, which, by the way, I have some Polish students here sometimes, not today. It's not the same in Poland, where in Poland in the 90s, the constitution making process was finished. And conversely, Lech Kaczynski does not have the votes in parliament to replace the constitution himself or with his ruling party. Orban did in Hungary. So the issues will be different in different places, but interest seems to be fairly general. So how to explain it? And I said I will pay attention to 4 theories, which it's all in my paper. If you rather read it, it's going to be there in more detail than I can actually deal with now. But let me just mention these 4 theories. Now, one theory is that of political constitutionalism. This is a theory that has been developed first in the UK by Poland before, as Poland and Hungary are different in how they deal with the issue of constitutional politics. And indeed, they are different, and you don't have to be told about that because you know it. But in any case, I mentioned it also to the class. Political constitutionalism that has been developed, as I said, by the UK, but has been anticipated by the Australian thinker Jeremy Waldron, and many Americans under the heading of popular constitutionalism. Larry Kramer would be one author. Mark Tushman occasionally fits into this camp as well. The idea is that political constitutionalism is superior and better than merely legal constitutionalism. What's the objection to legal constitutionalism? Well, legal constitutionalism means that a legal body, which is politically generally unaccountable, supervises adherence to the Constitution. Well, we know Americans in the class, Kelly and Adam and Elena know this very well. It's the Supreme Court, right, in the United States, which has been part of political battles since John Marshall's battles with Thomas Jefferson, since the decision concerning African American citizenship in the 1850s, since Reconstruction, since the New Deal, and so on. President Biden is going to encounter this. It is almost certain that he cannot preemptively deal with a Supreme Court where his opponents have at least 5 secure votes. The radical Republicans have 5 secure votes. So this is an ongoing issue in America. The political constitutional state is wrong that we have it this way. Why should an unelected body control adherence to something that has been a product, this is the U.S. lingo, of we the people, right? How can an unelected body control adherence to what the people themselves have produced and should themselves be able to control? That's popular constitutionalism, a version of political constitutionalism. But the people, of course, are not generally in great position unless there's a massive political mobilization to control constitutional adherence of any kind. And so the political constitutionalists generally say it is the other branches of power that have that responsibility. The political constitutionalism means that an elected body should be the main controller. If the court plays a role, it should be a minor one, bringing the elected body closer, raising the issue for the elected body that they must engage in constitutional politics. Assuming, for example, a violation by the president, it should be the role of the courts to alert and the legislature to control. If the violation by the legislature is the other way around. In a federalist system, it could indeed be the federal units that play this role. But as long as it is elected bodies that play the most important role, and if they can't resolve the question, then it should be another constitutional making process, using the amendment rule, for example, or even calling a new constituent assembly. That's more or less the perspective of the political constitution. Now, everybody, my friend Gabor Halmai does his best, immediately point out that no populist system, no populist government has ever followed this recipe. In other words, political constitutionalism is a theory of theory, is a conception of theorists. Paul Blocker, for example, whom I will mention in a second, also adheres to it. It is a theory, but it is not what populists in power do. Populists in power tend to substitute either the will of one branch for the interpretive power without any checks and balances, without any dialogue, as for example, Blocker calls it among the branches. In this sense, populist and popular constitutionalism should not be identified. The defenders of this theory now answer, though, is that isn't this the same for liberal constitutionalism? I mean, liberal constitutionalism has a theory, separation of powers, checks and balances, sometimes federalism. But in reality, those who have the power at any given time, or the greatest power, tend to be able to subvert constitutions as they will. Moreover, a liberal constitution is not supposed to institutionalize oligarchies. In other words, unelected elites, as in capitalist systems, the great business concerns, and yet, in terms of the actual working out of the Constitution, such elites gain a lot of power from the liberal Constitution, which never even mentions them, say in the U.S. They are not mentioned either by the original Constitution or any amendment. So the gap between normative and empirical is there for liberal constitutionalism too. And it can be there for populism as well. The normative theory being political constitutionalism, the actual reality is populist constitutionalism. And the gap between these two can be greater or lesser depending on the context. So that's theory one. And that's the most attractive theory for populist constitutionalism, because it indicates that it is really like liberal constitutionalism. It has limits, but those limits are going to be institutionalized in a variety of ways, and they limit less or more depending on the state. And that you can say for liberal constitutionalism too. Turkey has a liberal constitution still, and yet in reality very little of it controls the political branches of power. In the North European countries, which have liberal constitutions too, the constitutional controls and limitations are applied much more rigorously. Now, would be true also for populist constitutions in this particular conception. Mark Tushman, in particular, is adherent to this view. Constitutionalism is a matter of degree, he said. A perfect constitutionalism would be identity between the norm and the reality. An imperfect constitutionalism, like, for example, in Singapore, he says, means that only very limited, there's only very limited role for the norm, and the reality mostly can develop in its own way. The second view, which is not as favorable, is Paul Blocker's, who, as I said, in some of his essays seems to adhere to the first conception. But in most of his essays, he mentions three characteristics: instrumentalism, majoritarianism, and legal resentment. I think I assigned the essay where he presents these three ideas. So populists use all the devices of constitutionalism. Written constitution being the most important, having an amendment rule that can be periodically used to change the constitution, even judicial review stays alive in most populist constitutions. But now they are transformed in an instrumental fashion. And that instrumental fascination means that, for example, in the case of courts, after they've been packed, this is nicely shown by Mr. Sandursky in his study of the Polish constitution. First, the current ruling party has fought against the court. Then it managed eventually to transform its makeup. And since that time, the court has been used to be able to pass unconstitutional statutes as with Weber constitutional. So the capture of constitutional powers, which are instruments or which are institutions of liberal constitutionalism, can turn them into instruments of popular constitutionalism. The amendment rule is also like that. The amendment rule has been used in Turkey for a very long time. To give you another example, to improve political democracy, to improve the structure of rights. But from the middle of the 2000s, the famous headscarf amendments, the government of Mr. Erdogan began to use constitutional amendments to generate more and more power for his regime, eventually replacing it even by a presidential one with much greater powers for himself. The constitutional amendment, which is a very important institution and device of liberal constitutionalism, has been used by Orban, by Erdogan. Joanna, I don't know about Poland. I think no. I think that the current government has not been able to formally amend the constitution since 2014 or 2015. It would like to, but it hasn't been able to. But it depends on the case. And in lots of cases, two things are combined: the making of a new constitution and the use of the amendment, or sometimes even all three. Orban, Barbara and I are the ones who are the most blessed here. Orban has used all three, combining replacement, combining amendment, and also passing unconstitutional statutes, which are upheld rather by the constitutional court. Majoritarianism I mentioned because such instrumental politics has to be also legitimated, and it is legitimated by the fact that whoever controls these instruments is to a popular majority. Democracy should be majority rule. It should not be a minoritarian or a unelected body that controls constitutionalism. Here, instrumentalism converges with political constitutionalism. Majoritarianism, the link between the two. Nowhere did defenders of political constitutionalism say that majorities should be able to exercise a quasi-dictatorship for the period that their majority lasts. That's essentially the instrumental, an aspect of the instrumental term. And it is called abusive constitutionalism by yet another interpreter, a set of interpreters, David Landau and and Rosalind Dixon have written several articles focusing on abusive constitutionalism. Abusive constitutionalism means not just instrumentalism, but it means the deformation and degradation of those instruments through such use. There's no huge gulf between these two views, except that in the instrumental theory of Blocker, it's majoritarianism is the justification, whereas in the case of abusive constitutionalism, it is ultimately the possession of power that seems to be simply self-justifying. The final view I was going to mention again takes us back to a kind of constitutional theory that can be, at least in the eyes of some, be made legitimate. Obviously, abusive constitutionalism is the use of power for its own sake. Instrumentalism does not sound like a valid legitimation principle. That is why it's majoritarianism. Political constitutionalism is normatively justifiable, but on the other hand, the gap between the political and the populist is not easy to justify. It's a gap that should be reduced, and populist governments in power do the opposite, make the gap greater. A constitution of a constituent power, which has been proposed by two authors, I mentioned them, Correas and Colón-Rios, is a genuine theory. It goes back to Carl Schmitt, because the most famous source of the distinction between the constituent and constituted power, namely the Abbé Sieyès, would never have accepted constitutionalism to be based on the constituent, on the permanence of the constituent power, the semi-permanence of the constituent power. But the distinction he made, and he's not the first, it was made in the English Revolution and in the American too, by many people, Thomas Paine just perhaps most famous. The distinction allows for a development in a populist direction. Now, obviously, the distinction should be mentioned what it is. The constituent power is the power to produce a constitution. It is almost always a revolutionary principle, because in revolution, when a new regime is going to be established, the question is, who has the right to do so and on what basis? And the constituent power is, she has his answer to that question. Of course, for him, the constituent power belongs to the political community itself. He's a follower of Rousseau, except that in Rousseau, that community should be present directly in the fundamental acts of legislation. Whereas for Sieyès, for a big country like France, it was one of the biggest in Europe, over 20 million people at the time, there has to be representation. But in any case, the Constituent Assembly, Assemblée Constituante in Sieyès language, Rousseau simply called it the sovereign, is able to produce any constitution that it wants and has a right to do so as well. Because you cannot limit the people themselves. They could limit themselves, of course, voluntarily, but then they can remove the limitation just as they have initially imposed it. So the constituent power is really the power of sovereignty, popular sovereignty, embodied in an exercise of producing the Constitution itself. But that thing has still a purpose, as everything in political life, for the Abbé Sieyès. And what is the purpose but to produce a constitution? And why do you want to produce a constitution? Sieyès is a liberal, unlike his populist followers and Carl Schmitt. He's a liberal. He wants the arrangement to be a system of limitations separation of powers, checks and balances. Since he was actually going to accept the monarchy in 1789 when he wrote What is the Third Estate, the king can preserve executive power, but it will not be the absolute version of it. It will be a limited one by constitutional safeguards. And the Constitution of 1791, to which he has himself contributed, did establish a system of such safeguards. Whether Louis XVI would live under them or not is a matter of history. The arrangement led to only conflicts and eventually overthrow, executions, as you know the story. But in any case, the goal of the democratic constituent power is the liberal constitutive power. CS didn't use that distinction of democratic and liberal, but you can see the point. Now, of course, what form that liberal constitutive power will take is another matter, but there has to be such a thing. And the constitutive power, just as for the American writers of the Declaration of Independence, will come into play only when it has to, in revolutionary moments. If there is usurpation, if there is deviation, then the constituent power can come back and do another. Remember Thomas Jefferson. He thought this would have to happen every 30 years or so because the usurpation, the corruption are almost inevitable. So you must redo it periodically. Jefferson, as you know, was not a friend of judicial review when John Marshall introduced it, and his conception was really an alternative to it. Condorcet, too, in France, shared in a much more detailed constitutional draft Jefferson's ideas about it. There must be periodic radical revision to avoid corruption. This is like political constitutionalism, but it focuses on the constituent power more than just the political branches. And so you could say that the normative theory of populist constitutionalism is the constitution of the constituent power. Many populists live by this, and so you can see how constitutional replacement, even by them, cannot be the last word on the subject. Not that Orban refers to Thomas Jefferson in this context, although he might know about it. The fact that he, even once the new constitution was drafted, immediately produced some new articles which were to be added to the text after Parliament has agreed to the text to begin with. And this was also done in Venezuela even more radically because their referendum passed the Chavez Constitution in 1999. And after the referendum, Chavez added some additional articles of application, which were not themselves passed in the referendum. One could say, and this is what Colin Rios seems to suggest, I'm not sure exactly what his view with respect to Chavez was, and probably it has changed since Maduro's deformation of even Chavezian populism. But in any case, the idea that the constituent power doesn't disappear, but it is a power among the various powers of the separation of powers, and is even a higher power. It is not an active power in the sense that the executive does things every day, as you can read in a newspaper watching President Biden. And it's not active as often as some real legislatures. We cannot see the U.S. at the moment as a genuine legislature, given the Republican attitude to legislation. But legislatures also act on a, if not everyday basis, then a fairly regular basis within the political system. The constituent power isn't like that, but it is always there and is superior to them. Because once it is activated, no previous legislation, no previous court decision, no previous executive decree can survive its opposition to it. And this is the normative theory of populist constitutionalism to someone like Colonrius or to Corius. From a Chiesian point of view, uh, which I described in terms that try to link together the democratic and the liberal dimensions of constitutionalism, it would be a usurpation for the constituent power to be active all the time, because its purpose is to constitute. And if it is always active, if you have a permanent constituent assembly that is constantly legislating, if you want, and even making quasi-judicial decisions, decrees in the place of the executive, then you really have no separation of powers. Then you have no constitutionalism of any kind. That's at least what CS would have thought. But it is a coherent theory to argue in this context the opposite. So that's basically the four forms that people have argued for the existence of liberal constitutionalism. I would say two of them have a normatively positive justification. Two of them do not have that, unless you want to accept nothing but a pure majoritarianism as a legitimate form of justification. But in any case, in actual practice, you might see all four justifications being offered in different combinations and at different times in relationship to different matters. If you want, I hate this expression, but everybody's using it. The toolkit of populist constitutionalism involves these four theories. And they can be used by populists depending on the setting. The only one I know who would understand this is Viktor Orban, who, first of all, used the whole toolkit, and secondly, who has written on matters himself, which are related to this. But it doesn't matter whether they are conscious about doing what they're doing or whether they just do it unconsciously. In any case, any of these tools are ways of enhancing the power of those who control them, right? The political constitutionalism, generally in populism, is the constitutionalism of the executive. And surely all executives, this was even true for Franklin Roosevelt, all executives in principle like the idea that they're the guardians of constitutionalism. Instrumental constitutionalism, when it is enforced by a majority justification, is again one that people come to naturally, because if the majority chose me, I have a right to make all decisions until the majority replaces me. Abusive constitutionalism is nothing, has no positive dimension, but it is one that populists easily move into once they have a battle with an institution. In other words, if you are fighting the court, then first you want to defeat the court, and then in the process you come to the conclusion that wouldn't it be nice if that court actually is on my side, as powerful as before, but now on my side. And this, I think, is you don't need a theory for that. It's a natural. You fight the court. I think about Lech Kaczynski in this case. He's fighting the court. He has a problem with it. This is all there in Wojciech Sandusky's book on Polish populist constitutionalism. You realize how strong it is, and you don't have a constitutional amending majority. So why not use that strength for your purposes? It's not a theory initially, but it becomes a natural device. And the constituent power, well, without having read C.S. or Carl Schmitt, populists do understand, that to make a new constitution, makes them into a founding father or mother, framers, as we neutrally call them in the United States. And that is a very important dignity that politicians would like. And secondly, all the opposition you run into can be handled here in one blow, because you can simultaneously change the courts. You can simultaneously increase the power of the executive against Congress. You can reduce the power of the federal units. This is a device. It's the one part of the toolkit that contains the other dimensions, and it has legitimacy too, because the constituent power in modern theory is a democratic instrument. How democratic the actual processes are, well, that of course has to be discussed, but they will claim democratic legitimacy. Erdogan will claim that the amendments he has passed with the help of referenda are ultra-democratic. Orban will claim that his 2/3 is the will of the people, Hungarian people, and so he has a right to use the legal amendment rule of the Constitution, first the old one, then his own, because majorities are empowered to do so. So in any case, not only great powers, but legitimacy too can be achieved through a combination of these instruments, and perhaps most dramatically by the last one that I have mentioned. Okay, let me stop here for now, and let's see how far we get with the question and answer period. I didn't ask you to read anything on Mexico, so I think for the time being, we can suspend that discussion, but we can also go into it if anybody in particular is interested. So please, the floor is open for your questions, comments, criticisms, and it can be also about the previous session. I told you last time that the questions that were asked were good, but there were too few of them, so you can go back if you want to the previous. So who would like to start us off? Adam, you go first.
Sure.
Who did the second?
I have a few questions about your book, but I'll start with the question about the lecture. On the topic of abusive constitutionalism, it seems when you're talking about the deformation of the Constitution as an instrument, there's a potential for there not only being a destruction of it, but also an erasure of it or a forgetting. So I was hoping that you could speak to the way in which the Constitution is preserved within a national memory, if it is intentionally kept as something that is, if there's a linkage to a past constitution, if there is an argument for we are the only constitution, there has never been a constitution before. Basically, my question is, how does constitution remaking affect and interact with memories of constitutions?
Well, in different countries, these stories are different, because in some settings, I don't want to do Mexico. I'm fighting this impulse, but in Mexico, the 1917 Constitution remains the background for everything that Mexican executives do until perhaps Salinas Gortari, who, under the influence of the Washington Consensus and lots of economists educated in the United States, he himself has a Harvard degree, begin to radically shift from the spirit of this 1970 Constitution. But that's 1990s. So in Mexico, to answer your question to what I was not going to talk about, in Mexico, from 1917 to 1968, which is a particularly bloody and violent moment in Mexican history. In other words, 60 years, for 60 years, the tradition is constantly being relied on, expanded, developed, and looked back to with great deal of admiration, even though, interestingly enough, in Mexico, it cannot easily be linked to founding fathers, given the fact that Mr. Carranza, who was perhaps the founding father, is killed by other revolutionaries subsequently. So Mexico, one could say with Frank Tannenbaum, the Constitution is the greatest event, but it's the product of the masses. And it's looked back in a very positive way. Of course, it gets reinterpreted, it gets developed, it gets radicalized by Lázaro Cárdenas in the 1930s. So this is a living thing. In the U.S., it's not as beautiful a story. Well, on the other hand, it is much less violent a story, and I'm not a great fan of assassinating presidents and executing them. So the U.S. Is a much less violent story, but there, the development of the tradition is much more difficult and much more contradictory. But still, in the U.S., you can also see that the constitutional tradition is developed. And this relates, let me now link it back to the question of abusive constitutionalism. Because the development of a constitution in one stage could be seen as abusive from another stage. The Dred Scott decision, to take the most important example, is seen as abusive from the first moment on. Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans not only used it to justify formation of a new party, but denounced it from the outset. In the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln says what he thinks about Taney and the Dred Scott decision. So abusive constitutionalism could be also part of the tradition. And in that sense, a constitutional tradition battles against its own abuse. I think you see this in the Mexican case, but less strongly. Like, for example, Lázaro Cárdenas in the 1930s, forcing Congress to revise an amendment which allowed re-eligibility of presidents. That's what Álvaro Obregón passed, had the Congress passed in 1926. There was a clear abuse in terms of the tradition, which from the outset had a slogan, no re-eligibility. The two slogans of the Mexican Revolution, no re-eligibility and free vote. Well, the vote was not free for a very long time, certainly until 2000. But no re-eligibility was an important principle. And in an abusive moment, Álvaro Obregón removed it, had Congress removed it, the Congress that he controlled. So abusive constitutionalism can be part of the tradition too. In which case, what every constitutionalist will say is that the purpose of coming back to the Constitution is to remove abuses. Sometimes the abuses are in the original Constitution itself. The 3/5 compromise, from the point of view of the Declaration of Independence, is abusive to begin with. What does it mean to count people as 3/5? All men, and it originally I think meant women too, are created equal, says the Declaration. What do you mean you're 3/5? That's, even the original Constitution could have some, I think this is what you're driving at, that the tradition too could have abuses. And so in this sense, then, the populists are not the only ones who may engage in abusive constitution. The reason why I think Landau and Dixon are right in using this term, nevertheless, is once you have made a court into nothing but the tools of an executive, you not only have abused this feature of constitutionalism, but you have degraded it beyond recognition. And I think this you can say about the court packing schemes in Venezuela. I think in Bolivia too, eventually. And I leave it up to Barbara and to Joanna to say whether this dimension of the abuse in their two countries was a complete degradation of the meaning of a constitutional court, or whether neither Orban or Kaczynski were able to go that far. But you see, it's interesting, this issue of degree. Abuse turns out to be a matter of degree. You have abusive moments in liberal constitutionalism. Courts themselves, when they carry out nothing else but the interests of the most powerful social classes, are abusing their function. In this sense, the tradition of Lochner constitutionalism in the United States was itself abusive, and that's what Roosevelt rebelled against, proposing his own potential abuse, namely court back. Udipta, you had your hand up for a long time.
Yeah, no, it's a clarifying question. It wasn't clear to me. It seemed to me that, so if you understand the distinction between constituent power as the power to constitute versus another notion of sovereignty as the power to command, it seems to me populism tries to conflate the two, or maybe necessitates conflating the two. So it struck me as in the example you gave in the text about Front National's proposals, there is both a dimension of, at least maybe performative, but inclusion and plebiscitary, that aspect of participation, and at the same time a strengthening of executive power. So is it right that it's because of these two? Is that an outcome of the two concepts of sovereignty that populism is wrestling with, or is there a different cause for it?
Well, that's what is in the back of it, right? Is that in general, the concept of sovereignty in non-populist theories like that of Sieyès is kind of double, right? On the one side, and this is especially true in France, a country really of legislative supremacy, there is the sovereign one, the constituent power, that has the right to create the rules even for the legislature. And then there's a legislature which is understood in classical French theory as the sovereign in normal times, the normal sovereign, if you want, the king again having perhaps two bodies, but perhaps more bodies, because the electorate would be yet another body. And populism tries to make this plurality of sovereigns, the people's many bodies, let's call it many bodies, one, to unite them. And it can do so sometimes using the regular amendment rule. I mean, look at Hungary, one chamber legislature. Constitution can be altered by 2/3 of that legislature, to absolute 2/3. In other words, 2/3 of all the members, not the 2/3 of the ones present. This was true in the old rule. It's true in the new rule, but it's a power that is simply a function of a successful election, under both times, then and now, disproportional electoral rules. So it's kind of easy to have this. And yet, legally, Orban could fuse the two meanings of sovereignty thereby. India, this is much more difficult to do, because your amendment rule is more complex, and because there's a basic structure doctrine which the court has established fighting with Indira Gandhi. And that means that first you have to have a particular kind of election. Then I think you have to control a majority of the states. Correct me if I'm getting the amendment rule wrong. A majority of the states, not 3/4 like in the US, but a majority. And then you got to go up against the court, which says it's still illegitimate because the basic structure cannot be revised even that way. So for Modi to become Orban in this way is much more difficult. But of course, to the extent that he controls sufficient judicial appointments, you can do what in Britain has been done traditionally, namely pass statutes. And if there's no one to say it's unconstitutional, then an unconstitutional statute can be a way of justifying the Constitution. But it is not the clear-cut and open way that you're referring to by simply claiming all the powers of sovereignty to be in one person or one body. That's the most powerful way. And you can't do that everywhere. But you can do it everywhere if you have a revolution. That is, like an ex-prime minister of Hungary, József Antal or Antal József. Barbara no longer even remembers him, but she knows who he is. He would say, "Tetszettek volna egy forradalmat csinálni." Now into English. Isn't our language beautiful, by the way? And it's very, very formal. But in any case, my translation, maybe Barbara would do better. You should have made, gentlemen, I even add, because of the politeness, gentlemen and gentle ladies, you should have made a revolution in that case. If you wanted to pass such a law, for example. He was still an advocate of the constituted power. This indicates that he still has loyalty to the 89-90 Constitution, which was even provisional or whatever, but he was one of its makers. And so he says to the other side, to István Csurka and the populist rebels, you should have made a revolution, my man, if that's what you wanted to do. And I think that there will be people in India who will say at some point to Mr. Modi, well, if that's what you want, you should make a revolution. That's what the basic structure doctrine, by the way, says. It says so, right? Now correct me because I don't remember any other text, but the basic structure doctrine says you can do this only in the way that our forefathers, namely Mr. Nehru and Mr. Ambedkar and all the other ones, all the great framers. India is lucky it has some very great men, no women among them, but nevertheless, framers who are revered. Indira Gandhi surely revered one of them, her father. So when the court says to her, well, you should have done what your father did, namely to have a constitutional assembly, which could have done what you've done, wanted to do, but you can't do it by simply following one of the existing amendment rules. India has a complex set of them. So that's the problem here. Udipta's very good question takes me back to point 4. It's really a revolutionary principle, and compliments Lev Davidovich, who he is, like Bronstein, namely Trotsky, right? Compliments to Trotsky. This is a doctrine of permanent revolution, but not in his meaning. Nothing to do with one class activizing another class, and then a third class, and then eventually establishing communism or whatever he meant at any given time. This is, it does not focus on where one goes, only on how one does it. But it is a permanent revolution doctrine. I read Mr. Colin Rios, who's a very nice guy, and even wrote an article on me recently, so I should be really gentle to him. He's from Puerto Rico, but teaches in New Zealand, the poor guy. That's pretty far away from home, but it's an island too, and it's a nice one, so I think he's okay there. I read him because I tell him, that what you're proposing is a permanent revolution with your weak constitutionalism. But he doesn't mean it in the sense of a political revolution. He means it in terms of Jefferson, namely a periodic revision of the written constitution, whatever its problems are. But it is a revolutionary principle formally or procedurally. Anybody else? You can come back, Adam. I'm not sure if I answered your question previously.
You did.
I did. Okay. It's an important point too. Both questions are important because one point is that this idea of abuse, how much abuse is abusive? A. B. Isn't liberal constitutionalism sometimes abusive? the answer to both is correct. And here, yes, it's the fourth method is actually one that is based on a particular theory of popular sovereignty, which treats sovereignty as necessarily unified. It is not just a populist invention to try to unify sovereignty in this way. Some doctrines of sovereignty from the outset suggest that real sovereignty is always a unified entity, and there can be no division in it, no separation. So, for example, the French Revolution has always opposed federalism, because federalism breaks up sovereignty. And Alexander Hamilton, he was an American, not French revolutionary, had the same view, more or less. Anybody else? Well, some notes then on this Mexican case, since I said I was going to. The one point, of course, that immediately one realizes with Mexico is there is no single populist movement that creates its version of the constitutional regime, but it is a variety of stages, variety of actors, very often authors like Enrique Krause speak about 7 or 8 major figures who all play a big role. I'm not going to mention them now, unless you have some question about one of the phases. So there is no one leader, but several leaders succeeding one another, and until really the 1930s, there is no the government where all the powers of the state have been captured by one group. Mexican populism does not start with a party, but creates a party, a populist party. It goes under 3 names. I don't know if I have them, but yes, the National Popular National Party, the Popular Party of Mexico, and P stands for party. The National Revolutionary Party is the first, the Mexican Revolution Party is the second name, and the Institutional Revolution Party is the third name. This party is created only in the 1930s, and it becomes then a source of the kind of hybrid regime which I think does indicate populist constitutionalism, or a version of it. Now, what complicates this picture is the double character of this constitution. It is certainly from the 1930s on one of executive authoritarianism, but it is also one of social constitutionalism. So in this sense, the only way one can make sense of the Mexican hybrid is to treat it as relying on a host ideology of basically socialism for its development. This was already incorporated in 2 famous articles of the 1917 Constitution, Articles 27 and 123. But until the presidency of Lázaro Cárdenas, there was not much reality to these aspirational principles. So the Constitution becomes populist only with the formation of the party, and it becomes social only when that party is taken over by one particular president. Now, how did this happen? If it didn't happen through a populist movement or even an original populist party, how did it happen? In my treatment, it is the product of a revolution, a genuine revolution, perhaps one of the most important revolutions of the 20th century. The link between revolution and populism is not entirely accidental, as you have seen in my discussion of the constituent power. Populism represents a kind of domestication or institutionalization of revolution. No wonder that the Mexican party is called institutional revolutionary party. The Mexican revolution is a genuine revolution, and it becomes populist by institutionalizing, by domesticating revolution. In that sense, the elements of constitutionalism which I discussed are all present in Mexico at the high point. Political constitutionalism. Let me just focus on the Cardenas period now, when the system really comes to its own. Political constitutionalism. The president forces Congress. First of all, he purges Congress, and then forces Congress to change the tenure of judges from lifetime appointments to terms of appointment identical to that of the president, which allowed him to replace not just a lot of congressmen, a lot of judges too. So there is political constitutionalism, but it is of the executive, justified by the idea that the president is the people's elect, and it shouldn't be courts who control either constitutionality or the operation of the other branches. Instrumental constitutionalism, obviously, the control of the other branches is for the purposes of increasing the power of the central state and the dimension of the presidency that controls it. Abusive, well, no point in belaboring that point, but clearly a court and a legislature that can be packed at will are no longer able to play any role in the separation of powers. Constituent power, because the president both controlled the amendment rule and was able to pass legislation that would amount to informal constitutional change at any time. And this was done by Mexican presidents even before Cardenas. So the forms of justification of the forms of explanation, which in part justify populist constitutionalism, can all be applied to the Mexican outcome. But just to the Mexican outcome, because the process is one that begins with liberal constitutionalism. Along with all the constitutional revolutions of the 20th century, the revolution begins with a demand of controlling autocratic rule. It wants to, in the Mexican case, revitalize a genuine legislature and independent courts. So from a normative point of view, the Mexican Revolution begins with liberal constitutionalism. This fails at different stages, and it fails also on a level of its origins, because from the outset, in order to get popular support, the liberal constitutionalists had to compromise with social constitutionalists influenced by socialism and anarchism, by left-wing radicalism. So from the outset, a compromise constitution, which points beyond liberalism. What about its social dimension, though? Its social dimension, too, is achieved through successive presidencies. But the one thing that is constant, and where there are no backward movements, is the growth of the executive. The increasing power of the executive. The first president of the revolution, Francisco Madero, was the only one who was not interested in executive aggrandizement of power, and he lost power and was assassinated as a result. Many of the others were assassinated too, but only by those who wanted to increase presidential powers just as much or even more than they themselves. They all wanted to put it into different hands. So the social dimension becomes the normative core, especially because autocratic power could not be justified in a revolution which was started against autocratic powers themselves. In order to compensate the illiberal features from the outset, the social dimension became the primary until 1990s. Well, perhaps 1968. That social dimension remains dominant. Is this a populism? Is this outcome a populism? Well, the socialism is a funny socialism. As you see in lots of socialist countries, where the peasantry is the majority of the population, in Mexico, too, the minority, the proletariat represents only a minority. So from the outset, those military leaders who are the main agents of the Mexican Revolution must simultaneously appeal to several classes. And in this sense, socialism, agrarianism, anti-authoritarianism are competing ideologies within the framework. Populism becomes a key temptation in order to bring together and to unite these alternative forms of political aspiration. I call the outcome, nevertheless, in spite of its mixture of elements, a populist constitution because of several of its features, and I will end with this. One thing is the dominance of the executive, namely the reduction of the separation and division of powers is characteristic. Now, you could say that is characteristic of socialism too. But in the Mexican case, that executive power remains an elected one. When earlier on I distinguished between socialism, fascism, and populism, I follow those who stress the electoral turn. The Mexican version of executive dominance remains electoral. It has been electoral from 1910 on till yesterday, till the election of López Obrador. Elections are always held. And the Mexican principle of no re-election has, with the one exception of Obregón, has also been adhered to. So not only do you see executive dominance, but you see executive dominance through continual alternation of the holder of executive power. Okay, there is another exception, the so-called Maximato of the 1920s and 30s with Mr. Calles controlling the succession to people who would become his puppets 2 or 3 times in exact. But even that is only done once. In other words, elections and non-reeligibility are maintained by the Mexican regime. Unlike fascism, with which it sometimes has some elements in common, unlike state socialism, with which it has many more elements in common, for example, also collectivization of a significant part of agriculture. But unlike these two systems, the electoral principle remains dominant. Are these elections free and fair? No, mostly they are not, and sometimes ridiculously unfair. But nevertheless, those who hold power control in the end only the identity of the person who succeeds them and not the power itself. So in this sense, the Mexican constitutional system, its mixed origins, and its debt to socialism and to other radical doctrines, is a populist hybrid, if you want to call it a competitive authoritarian structure. And of course, the socialism, and I end with this, is itself a left populist version, because at no moment do the Mexican presidents entirely socialize either industrial or land ownership. The most significant achievement of the revolution is usually referred to as Article 27 of the Constitution, which establishes the principle that the nation owns all land, and especially the stuff underneath it, the subsoil. But the nation can establish a variety of forms of usage called property forms through which the land can be cultivated or exploited in the case of the subsoil. So it can give franchises. It can establish even de facto private owners. It can create collective ownership, as it did on the land for a long time, but it can reverse that as well. This is not a communist system or a state socialist system in terms of its structure of ownership. But when it comes to industry, there were nationalizations of foreign owners, especially in the area of extraction, oil, and minerals. Otherwise, Mexican ownership retains the structure of capitalism to the extent that a variety of users can continue to operate under the aegis of some significant governmental regulation and control. They can be expropriated, they can be punished, but they can be reinforced as well. So if you want a populist economic system, which perhaps you could find in Venezuela and in Bolivia at a certain moment of Chavez and Morales' dominance, the Mexican case becomes the forerunner of combining different property forms, of using regulation, but usually with the aim that comes out of the social dimension of equalization and social welfare. The other famous article of the Constitution, Article 123, which I think is dependent on social democracy as its host ideology, whereas you could say that the land ownership depends on state socialism as a host ideology, at least with respect to most of agriculture. When it comes to industry, it is social democracy that is the host ideology. What does that mean? It means an 8-hour day. It means workers' health insurance. It means disability insurance. It means what it means in lots of social democratic countries, tripartite bargaining when it comes to disputes. In other words, corporatism, societal corporatism, in which the labor union, the employers, and the state represent three agencies that bargain concerning working conditions, concerning a strike, concerning the salary structure. Mexico accomplishes this sooner than social democratic countries, mostly. But I would say that the realization, at least on the constitutional level, 1917, is earlier than the Weimar Constitution, earlier than the Soviet Constitution. But in terms of its realization, it is exactly the same epoch in which the New Deal undertakes measures of this kind, and Swedish Social Democrats undertake similar measures that Lázaro Cárdenas accomplishes the worker protections which are implied by the Constitution. I don't want to underestimate the constitutional justification, but in terms of development, Mexico, alone of Latin American countries, perhaps Chile is another where there are some parallels, develops together with much more wealthy countries, the social democracy of much more wealthy countries, accomplishing many of the same things. And so I think we can see the executive dominance and the role of popular sovereignty in this system as specifically or generically populist, and we see the host ideologies operating as well, but deriving important features from social democracy and to some extent from state socialism. Okay, I will stop, and of course you're free to ask questions about other parts of this. The Mexican thing is a kind of appendix to our discussion, and I think it's important just to show that whatever we think logically in terms of the contradiction between constitutionalism and populism, it is possible to reconcile these dimensions in practice, and the Mexican case represents the best example of that. Okay, anybody, questions, issues? Yes, Adam.
This is less of a question, more of just a curiosity and an inability to answer it myself. You mentioned assassination a few times through the lecture. And at each point, it seemed like it was sort of a secondary topic. You know, they happened to be assassinated. We moved on. But if we take a lot of the lessons we've learned about populism, it seems like the death of the leader would be a huge, huge impact on the death of the personified public, right? The people dies as the leader dies. Is there a marked shift that we see when a populist leader dies across nations? Is there a singular kind of response? Is there like a martyr archetype that the next populist leader then fulfills? Or am I giving too much weight to assassination?
Sorry. Let me talk about Mexican murders and populism first, because I could flash my undergraduate lecture here. It's here, and you will see, if you're seeing that, under 1H, I have violence and assassination. And Francisco Madero, the liberal revolutionary, assassinated Emiliano Zapata and Francisco Villa, two popular revolutionaries, are assassinated. Venustiano Carranza, the only person who earns the title of a father of the country in 1970, assassinated. Under Caius, several people are assassinated, including Obregon, who was assassinated after his re-election. He managed to a constitutional amendment to allow himself to be re-elected against the whole spirit of the revolution. And then he's assassinated by a Catholic fanatic over an entirely different issue, namely their suppression of the church, something I didn't really talk about today, but it's an important feature of this particular version of revolutionary populism. Obregon himself has two people killed who run against him in his first election. In the end, if you look at Wikipedia, the 1928 election, 1924 election of Obregon, the first one, he has no, Wikipedia is so charming, he runs unopposed. And that's because there were two people who considered the election to be fixed even before it was held, and they rebelled, the two other candidates. They were both executed. So the reason why they're absent from Wikipedia as other candidates is because they were executed by Obregon. They failed in their uprising and they disappeared as candidates. So you see enormous amount of violence here, which is itself a problem, and it doesn't stop after the Second World War either. Assassination of Colosio, of Monsieur, two important figures, Colosio being a candidate for the presidency again. And so in that sense, this violence in Mexican history is something that Lázaro Cárdenas tried to stop it. He only sent Caius to an exile in the United States, to Stanford, which is a pretty nice place for him. And so in that sense, one person didn't play that game, but the others played it. Madero also didn't play that game. Madero in the two bookends, Madero and Cárdenas, do not play the game. Now, it's a very serious problem for populism, right? Because the way we try to define a phenomenon is in terms of leadership. And in the Mexican case, if you were a leader, whether grassroots like Zapata and Villa, or of some kind of elite mobilization like Madero and Carranza, generals, a lot of the people, with the exception of, but there's no exception in terms of my list. They're all generals also. So they live by violence and they die by violence. This creates a problem of the embodiment model for populism. In other words, you have at most successive populists in the Mexican case, and some of these leaders are not even at certain points very popular. So you have a theoretical issue, and I think it is solved by the method of what sometimes Mexican calls the method of the finger, dedazo, namely appointing your successor. The populist leader does not remain a leader beyond a single term, but picks his successor, which could not be done until they created a party. This means that Caius and Cárdenas, who are really the creators of the one party, create the conditions under which you can have serial populisms embodied in different leaders. And that's what the Mexican system is. It's an amazing system. And I don't know what López Obrador is going to, again, he's a figure with populist rhetoric. Is he going to try to either remove the no re-election principle or just simply try to pick his successor? And since 2000 or so, there is party competition. So it is not certain that he could win or his successor could win. Whether he could pass such an amendment is also doubtful. So Mexican populism shows, in a way, that with high level of collective creativity, you can replace the personal embodiment. But you do need a party, and you need this crazy device. And I think you need to be able to cheat in elections too, because the Dazzo worked only as long as you could fix it. You see some of these elections, it's fascinating. You look back historically, there are people who get, as they get several million votes for the winner, there are people who get maybe a few thousand. It's not possible. It's simply not possible. And this was part of how it was done. And as people point out, from 1994 on, which was the last such huge fixing of an election by Salinas against Enriquez, the son of Cardenas, it could be done electronically. Up to then, they had to stuff the boxes. But from the 1990s on, you could do it like I'm moving my cursor. And you could do it. You could change the numbers electronically, which is what was done, and why initially it was immediately discovered and revealed, because it's much more difficult to hide when it's done this way. But this is part of, now, your question, whether violence against leaders is a significant part of the populist phenomenon. And even as I was talking, I was thinking about that part of your question. And the only thing I can say is that populism invites that, to the extent that this Mexican solution has not been discovered. And even the Mexican solution, I tell you in just a second, is unstable for a significant reason. But if the Mexican solution didn't exist, then Orban and Modi and Kaczynski are all threats to whoever else within their own party or outside of it thinks that they could do a better and different and more radical or less radical populism. So in that sense, assassination, which is not as customary in some countries as in others, is a fairly natural option here. And it is, even the Dazzo doesn't get rid of it, because as in all these Mexican cases, one can see, the previous president has a choice. Lázaro Cárdenas had a choice. For example, the closest person to him was Mujica, one of the founding fathers, also of the 1970 Constitution, a very radical man, influenced by anarchism. He taught Cárdenas the social doctrine. But Cárdenas didn't want to pick someone so controversial and pick someone else. Because he wasn't into killing people, Mujica survived this until the 1960s, I think. But previously, what would happen is that those who were neglected in the Dazzo would rebel, in which case they became a terrible threat to the person who did get the finger. So it's even, populism, because of its embodiment model, because of its personal embodiment model, seems to invite, since it fixes the political game, or tends to, assassination becomes the way of dealing with that if the political game has been too fixed. And the Dazzo, which tries to save the skin, if you want, of the previous president, only endangers a future one. Colosio was like that. And this is recent. Now, I don't have the date now. Colosio was picked by I guess, Salinas. Salinas was the president, and he picked Colosio as the successor, and Colosio then is assassinated. It is said because there were other elements of the PRI that didn't want him, were afraid of him or whatever. And Monsieur, one of the leaders of the previous assassinated subsequently. Sometimes they're counter assassinations. You'll kill my guy, we'll kill yours. I think that's your question, right? That does the populist logic, in a way, open up the possibility of assassinations? Now, I cannot, we have so many populist governments all over the world. This is not a quantitative study, but it is one that should be looked at across the board. Okay, that was pretty exhausting for me because of this weird format. I think it is not going to be the format we follow simply because it puts too much burden on you, and some of you don't like it and don't, are not always ready and so on. We're moving to a topic, next time, which is related to what we were just doing, namely the economic dimension of populism. The economic dimension of populism. We're reading Béla Greskovic and Roberts as our sources, but what is really lucky in this particular case is that this Friday, Greskovic himself gives a lecture. So we have Greskovic this Friday, and I don't know if I planned it this way or it happened by accident, probably by accident because these things happen by accident usually. But he is a major source for our discussion next week. And that forces us to return to the epochs of populism, because what is usually understood as populist economics, economic populism, with which this Mexican hybrid has a lot in common. I mean, you could regard Lázaro Cárdenas as an economic populist if you wish. That version of populism becomes much less likely in the neoliberal epoch. And even subsequently, we'll see if populism turns up again in terms of eclectic mixes of various types or hybrids of various kinds. We'll see that later on. Okay, so let's stop here, and we will resume a week from now. But hopefully, you can all come for Friday's lecture by Greskovic.